And welcome back to Launch 2017. Corey Hines, Kirk Monroe, and today we are looking at how we integrate the lab platform into, well, honestly, virtually anything. We're looking at a couple of things, looking at our LTI solutions for things like OpenEdX, our JSON. Is it Jason or JSON? How do you
I say Jason.
Jason? I say JSON, it sounds more sophisticated. Our JSON API, so you can do things like just .NET or Java or whatever.
That would be REST API, technically.
Well, technically REST API,
yeah.
Right, yeah. He's the guy that knows this stuff. That's why he's doing the session, not me. And then also a PowerShell module that we have. So if you're one of those guys like Kirk, you can launch labs from PowerShell. You can get your data from PowerShell. So we're going to take a look at how we do all those things. So without further ado, Kirk.
Thanks, Corey.
Let's take a look.
Morning, afternoon, and evening, everybody. So I'm going to show you a bunch of cool examples of what we can do for lab integration into different platforms. I'll talk about the different pieces of information you need to know, and then I'll do some demos to show you what it looks like firsthand, and just to start the discussion. And I'll also provide you with some resources that will help you along your journey as you start getting into this yourselves. So when you think about integrating labs, there's a few questions that you might ask yourself, a few reasons that you might come to a session like this trying to get this information. If you're building courses in OpenEdX, OpenEdX is a platform that allows you to create courses that are often used for MOOCs or sometimes used for just smaller courses offered through learning institutions. And so if you're building courses there and you want to have online labs, you can integrate our content into that. Technically, that's done through a specification called LTI. It's a standard, and we are an LTI provider, and we integrate into any LTI consumers. OpenEdX is just one example.
One of the interesting things about OpenEdX is a lot of large companies right now, are adopting this notion of MOOC, massively open online curriculum, or massively open online curriculum, which is just this, kind of standard way of consuming self-paced learning modules, videos, documents, et cetera. But, increasingly they want a hands-on component to it, whether it's an assessment. One of the big things that's popular on OpenEdX, for example, is the notion of you can get a completion certificate. And so to do that, you've got to demonstrate some sort of learning through taking quizzes, or increasingly through PBT, which is our next session, on how you can score different lab environments. And so this integration allows you to plug all the power of LOD into these open, massively used broad platforms like OpenEdX. And that's just one example. There's many, many more, but that's one that's kind of hot right now.
Absolutely. And so if you're interested in that sort of thing, that's one thing I will demonstrate inside the session. Another thing I'm going to show you, before I started working with Learn On Demand, I used to work at a company that used Learn On Demand as a service. And so what we wanted to do in that organization was we wanted to basically have lead generation off of our site. If a customer came to our site or a prospect came to our site looking for our product and trying to learn more about it, we wanted them to be able to read documentation about the product, and also right from that website go directly into a sandbox where they could try the product out firsthand. No need to download and go through installation steps and any of that nonsense. You just dive directly into the sandbox, the product's right there, and you can learn how that works. And so that was integration point that we used, and I find that's useful, so I want to share that kind of work with other people.
And that's, to me, that's a really interesting way of looking at it, because, we often think of this as a platform for training, but it's also a sales platform, because you can build labs for the purpose of selling your product, right? Come to my website, don't just watch a video, read a white paper. Here, click the button and try it, and if you like it, it sells itself. And so we have a lot of customers that have sales-oriented, market-oriented sandbox environments on their sites, and they just want the data out of that. So this helps them do it.
Yeah, for us it was great. It shortened our sales cycle because our product was complicated to install and set up, and so that just that was a win for us. And then another question you might ask is, how do you track usage of your labs so that you know who used them and for how long? This one ties into the sales side of the fence as well, because if you have people who are leveraging a sandbox where you have your product installed and you're using lead gen, you might want to qualify those leads and know, well, who do you want to go talk to first? Is it the guy who tried it for 15 minutes and then went away and never came back? Or is it the guy who came to your lab 3 times and used it for 2 hours each time? You can figure out who you want to go talk to and make sure that they're getting information they need, and qualify that lead to go directly to your to go into your sales funnel. And then also, what about automation? I'm a PowerShell MVP, and I love automation. And so through the work I did at this previous company, I also did some automation work with Lab on Demand's API and PowerShell. And so I'll talk about that.
And just to emphasize that point, however much you think he loves automation, it's way worse than you think. Trust me. He's obsessed with automation.
Just because I've been using it for 10 years doesn't mean I'm obsessed. But yeah, I like it a lot. So the first thing is LTI. LTI stands for Learning Tools Interoperability, and it's a global standard. There are a couple different versions of LTI out there. We support LTI version 1.1.1 for launching labs, and version 1.0 for lab outcomes. Lab outcomes, that's for score reporting. So when Corey just mentioned that we're going to talk about PBT in the next session, well, Corey is with David. That's the outcome of your performance-based testing can be sent into edX, and that's through the Outcome API. We also, the way we work with LTI is we work as a provider. So LOD is a provider, and we provide content to any LTI consumer, which is edX or any other system that implements the LTI standard as a consumer.
Yeah, the whole idea behind LTI is that you have little nuggets that represent things you want to learn that are literally all over the internet, right? It might be anything from a YouTube video to a document to a lab, anything at all. And you want a standard where, I can build a course or a training tool that references bits and pieces from anywhere and everywhere. And so LTI was the standard that all these organizations agreed on to be able to do that. So, I can have my course call something from your course, and there's a way for that to happen. And that's where LTI came from. It's a very simple standard, right? There's not a whole lot of capabilities in there. It's basically, hey, watch the video. Here's the video. Yes, you watch the video. There's not a whole lot more to it. But as a step to get there, to share all this data, it's fantastic.
Oh, it's great. And it's like, you want it to be as easy as building Lego blocks, right? Because you want each piece, you just put it together to assemble what your lab content is for your students, and that's what the standard's all about. Excuse me. So when you're working with LTI consumers, so OpenEdX, they need 3 things to be able to pull content from an LTI provider like LOD. They need a key, which is like your username, right? So that's just identifying who you are. They need a secret, which is akin to your password. That lets that key actually work. So the key identifies who you are. The secret says, yes, I can verify I am who I say I am, so I have access to this content. And then you need a URL. So you need the actual URL for the lab, and that allows edX to actually open up that lab using your key and your secret to actually get at the content. So you can learn more about LTI and the standard by visiting this URL. So imsglobal.org is the organization that manages the global standard. And there's lots of detail about LTI 1.1 and LTI 2.0 and all the different versions that are out there and what you can do. But we're just going to focus on how it works with edX inside this session. So OpenEdX and LTI. Integration with OpenEdX requires just 2 things. When you're working inside of OpenEdX, you need to create a passport. The passport is a combination of your key, your LTI key, which, as I mentioned, identifies who you are. The secret verifies that you are who you say you are. And some identifier, the identifier you pick. So when you're looking at your lab content, you can just pick some arbitrary ID for your lab that represents something. Maybe it represents the lab number. Maybe it's a combination of things that represents your number as well as language for the lab or the exercise that they're working in. And so you define these IDs that you can use when you're going to pull LOD content.
So in the example you've got right there, you've got this LTI 101-EN.
Yes.
That's just an arbitrarily, it means something to me. And I can use it for the purpose of tracking, reporting, or anything like that.
Yes.
And then the other 2, the 2 GUIDs, are basically your username and password.
Right.
Essentially. Okay, makes sense.
Yeah, it's not just a long string of characters here, because you can kind of blur when you look at all the content, but it's basically your user-defined ID, colon, the key, which is a GUID, colon, and then the secret. And then that's your key.
So you're defining that once per course.
Well, you can define multiple passports per course. You can, yes. You only need a minimum of 1. But you can have multiple if you want to break it down. And the only reason you would use multiple really is for the reporting side. If you want to use different IDs for different things in the course to track different stuff, you could use multiple in that case. And then you also need the launch URL. And the launch URL comes from the lab profile inside of LOD, and that's a URL that only works via LTI. You can't take it and drop it into your
And
web
so,
browser.
a little tip for folks as they've asked us about this. It's one unique URL per lab, but the URL is predictable. So that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, every lab in the system is going to have the same LTI URL, but that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the end is the lab ID. So if you run a report or whatever and you get all your lab IDs, your LTI URLs are predictable. Now, without the passport, the URLs go nowhere, right? It's just a dead URL. But when you combine the URL with the passport data, which is the access key, now you can launch that via LTI.
Yes.
So you don't need to go in and generate these things or find them or search for them. If you know your lab IDs, you can predict what the URLs are going to be.
That's exactly right. And so you can read more about OpenEdX and LTI. OpenEdX has some great documentation online about all the different things you can do with it, including LTI integration. And there's a link there for that. And then also you can go to our very hot off the press guide that I just published literally 2 minutes before this session.
He did. He's not joking. He said, "Hey, I got the guide published." I went, "What, now?" Sweet. So you can literally almost be the first person to look at that.
That's right, and so I'll show you that. Anyway, that's up on GitHub. We did a session on GitHub the other day, and we love GitHub, and I love GitHub. And yeah, I just published our guide up there so you can consume that
You
content.
love text files, just admit it.
I do. I love anything text, so where I don't have to try to decipher what somebody wanted to do with the UI. And so now I'm going to go into, oh, I didn't mean to click on that link. I'm going to go into a demo that shows you how this stuff works. So we're going to go deeper into OpenEdX and LTI. So let me just jump over to my browser. And so I've got, this is our guides page. So if you go to github.com, Learn on Demand Systems, and then into our guides folder, we have, let me go up one level. We have a document right at the very top level. You can go into our guide section that shows you all the different guides we have. And this is the one that's hot off the press, is integrating LOD into OpenEdX. And so if you click on that, you just get a big text document with integrated images that walks you through the kind of things that I'm going to talk about here, which just shows you what it looks like, talks about the passport, how it works, all those details. So there's a lot of content here that you can review offline, which is a great refresher for the content I'm covering here. Now, when I go into the actual integration and how that works, I'm going to open up here an instance I have of edX running on Azure. Now, this edX instance...
So just before I clarify, so what you did here is you took the Bitnami instance?
No, this actually was just installed using the, what do they call them? The ARM template.
Okay, so there's an ARM template on Azure for edX where you can have your own edX server.
Yes.
And so you just built your own instance of edX, and you built a course, and you plugged LOD into the course.
Yes.
Sweet. Okay.
Yep, and
Do we have guidance on how to do that or no?
That probably not right now, but
Okay, we should do that.
Yeah. So yeah, it's as simple as launching the process, and then you let it run for a couple of hours, and then it's done, and you can hop in and start using it. And so I've got this server stood up, and there's a few courses in here, and I'm going to talk about this LTI Demo 2 course. So I mentioned that you need to configure a few things. So let me just jump into this course and show you what the configuration looks like. The first thing you're going to want to do when you go into your course that you want integration with is you're going to want to go into the, you open up the course page, go into settings, and then into advanced settings. And the very first thing you need to do to enable LTI is to add this string to your advanced module list.
And this is in your documentation, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay, good.
Yep. And so this string, LTI consumer, just basically says I am enabling LTI consumer functionality inside of this OpenEdX lab. So you add that
OpenEdX course.
course.
Yes.
Yes, that's right, not that. Thank you. And so you add the LTI consumer string, that lights up the LTI functionality, and then you scroll down until you get to LTI passport. And so let me go down, it's alphabetical.
So while you're scrolling, I can't quite see the questions that are coming in on the screen, so if you guys can just move that up a little bit, that'd be great. All right, Kirk, go ahead.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, that's great. So we will do that guide on setting up the OpenEdX lab. Thanks for showing interest in that. So yeah, so after you set up your LTI consumer tag for the course, you scroll down to LTI passports, and then you enter this string. And a few things about this, because I wasn't quite sure, do I need to put it in quotes, do I not need to put it in quotes? It's a string, so you just add it in quotes. If you want multiple, they're comma separated, and you have 3 parts. In this case, I've got my, oh, where did I just go? Scrolled funny. I've got my LTI ID that I chose, right? So this, if you are the edX course author, You pick your identifier.
You just make this up.
Yep, anything at all you want.
Now, we actually, we haven't even talked about this, honestly, but we have some plans to give you some capability with that back in the platform so that you can actually predefine these strings on the platform and do things like custom expiration dates for passports. So if you're coming in from, website 1, it'll expire on a certain date, but website 2, it's a different date. So we've got some fun things we're planning on doing with this little portion of it, just to give you some capability. It's going to come in the near future, but you just make this up for now.
Yes, that's right. So you define your key, and so I just usually pick the name of the course, but you could have other qualifiers on here that are important to you. And then I put my client identifier, and then the key, and then the secret. And the secret I'm not going to scroll over and show you because it's
really?
my
Why not?
secret. But
You're not going to show us your password, Kurt?
I'm not going to show you my password. But the key and the secret combined with colons between them inside of a double-quoted string, that's your passport. Excuse me. So
Now, if you're not familiar with LTI, an LTI passport is another word for a credential. Basically, it's a credential. That's all it is.
So once you have defined your LTI passport or passports, because I mentioned you can have multiple, you go back into your course content, and then you can actually start adding LTI content into your course. So I've got this unit called Welcome, and so there's an LTI integration section inside of here. Or sorry, I should say it's a section called Welcome and the LTI integration unit. And so if I go into the settings for this guy, LTI integration, you're going to notice that it's going to launch a lab right away down at the bottom. Because when you're working in the editing experience, it lets you see firsthand what that looks like. And so here is a lab launching that shows an introductory video while it launches, and the content and the VMs are loading in the background. And the way that actually happens is you just go into the edit page. Actually, sorry, let me qualify this a little bit. If I was to add a component, so that if this was an empty unit, I would go to Advanced, and I would add an LTI consumer. There may be multiple advanced, but in this case, LTI consumer is the only advanced functionality that I turned on. And so I add that LTI consumer functionality, and then I go to edit my functionality for the consumer. The video is grabbing my attention. And so if I go into edit on a consumer.
Well, it is a very attention-grabbing video. I mean, you look incredible in that video.
Thank you. So inside of your consumer, you have a display name. That's the name of the actual the unit. And then you have two things.
So would you rename that display name, or is that just fixed?
Oh, you could, yes. So right now.
I could call this lab 2.
Yeah, so right here you see this text that shows up in the left, right? You can put whatever tag you want. So I'm actually going to take that one out because I just added a new one, and I'll show you the existing one to get to the actual filled-in form. So if right here it says LTI consumer, but I could call this lab 1 content, or whatever you want to call it, right? It's your choice. Then you need your application information. Excuse me. This is just a description of the third-party application. So it's just text, right? You're just describing it. This doesn't really, it's not part of the passport or anything. This is just something for identifying what the LTI content is that you're using. But the two things that you need that are important for it to actually make it work are your LTI ID.
Which tells you which passport to use.
Exactly, right? So multiple passports. You pick the one you want. You drop that ID right here. That identifies the passport you're going to hand off during the authentication. And then the launch URL, which is your lab ID right here. So in this case, I'm launching lab 27636 using the LTI passport LOD LTI edX2. And that just basically does all the synchronization work so that when a student comes in, it's going to take those two pieces of information, fire them off over the web to us, pull down that content, and show you your integrated lab inside of the lab environment.
Now, I've noticed, and you may be getting to this, but you've got that lab running in line, like
Yes.
in an iframe.
Yep.
Can you pop it out? If
Yes,
you want? You can control
absolutely.
all those things. How do you do that?
So yeah, so I mean, this is just the basic information at the top.
Yep.
But if you scroll down, you get into a bunch of other stuff. So launch target, that defines where, right? So I've got it inline, and that's the default. But I can make it modal, or I can pop it up in a new window.
What does modal mean?
So if you click on modal, it actually says right here. Select modal if you want the LTI content to open in a modal window in the current page, so you can't click back
Yeah,
into
you're
the lab
basically
environment.
forced into it, right?
That's right.
All the developers are going, I know what a modal dialog box is. I know that, but a lot of the LMS guys don't. But it's, you can't do anything else with the lab. So
That's right.
It takes it over.
And one of the nice things, actually, just pointing out these comments right here below the fields, edX is actually fairly good at describing what you're going to use where, so you can figure it out on the go because there's got inline documentation like this. So yeah, so you can pick modal, or you can pick just new window that's not modal, which allows people to flip back and forth if they want to. Because maybe you want to have a lab running in a window on the side while you're also looking at content inside of your edX course, and so you can do that as well.
You got the flexibility. And this is all just edX platform stuff.
Yep,
right?
that's
There's
it.
nothing, the only LOD bits in here are the fact that the lab exists in LOD, and we're just calling it from edX.
And then you can tweak things like the inline height. So I mean, I like to pick my inline height at 600. I played with it to figure out what looks best. So you can play around with that, or your modal window width and height, you can set those. And then you've got some interesting things such as scored. So we talked about PBT coming up. If you have a lab that has performance-based testing built into it, and a student goes through that lab and completes the exercises and they get a score, the percentage, which will be a number between 0 and 1 that they achieved, right? So we do it based on just a decimal percentage. We send a value between 0 and 1 at the end of the lab, gets sent back into edX so that we can report back that score.
Now there's policy you can set on that 0 and 1 to give it different meaning, right? So for example, and we'll do a little bit of this in the next session on PBT, but as a bit of a preview, for example, if this lab is an IDL where we have all the lab steps, we've got 100 lab steps in there, and you do 50 of them, it'll return 0.5. That's one thing you can set. You can also say, you know what, this lab is an hour long. If you spend 60 minutes in there, it returns a 100%. If you spend 30 minutes of the recommended 60, it returns 50%. There's also this notion of a minimum time where you can say it's a 60-minute lab, but you're required to spend a minimum of 20 minutes. If you spend 10 of the 20, it returns a 0.5. If you spend anything over 20, it returns a 1. So there's on the LOD side, there's a policy engine where you can dictate the meaning of what that return value is. So it's not, you can change how you score an LTI lab essentially. So,
which is great. Stop people from gaming the system, make sure that they're actually doing the work. So that's how you integrate LTI inside of a lab environment. And one thing I wanted to show you really quick is that, so here I've got my live lab, and I've gone through the video already, and I can close at this section, and then I'll see another video pop up in this particular lab. And so let's say I do a few exercises. So I'm just going to click on done a couple of times, right? And more videos pop up because this is a lab that has it's a very interactive experience, and so the videos keep telling me what I need to do, and then I can go and do that work, and then I can verify that work. And so here I'm on step 4. And let's say that the way that my integration is set up, I want students to go in and out of an existing lab. So I've got this lab environment, and I'm done this particular step. So I'm going to save and close my exam. And yes, so it'll just preserve the lab environment. My exam is saved.
and so just for the record, this is not actually an exam. This is a lab that you're doing.
Oh, that's right. That's great. Yeah, this one has an exam at the end, but yeah, that's right. So I mean, it could just be a lab where I save the state. And now, when I refresh my window, if I was to come back into this lab environment again, loading my lab content, should just take a moment. The point I'm trying to show you is that you can resume. So right here, you see I picked up right where I left off. I'm still on the same step. So when you have this integration and you want to have one lab that is maybe fairly large, and you want to go through different segments of that lab integrated with your edX courseware, you can do that, right? You can save your state and then continue on in the next segment and work through the whole content. So that's Open edX integration in a nutshell.
That's fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's pretty powerful and a lot of fun to work with. And so then, oh yeah, this is the student's view. So I just want, like that, there I was working as an actual creator. And inside of Open edX, you can view the live version and then go through that same process by clicking on the exercises here, welcome, and go into your labs and do the same thing. So I don't need to show you that. So let me go back to my slide deck. So that's the demo of Open edX. Now let's talk about the Lab on Demand API. So we currently are on version 3 of our REST API that integrates with Lab on Demand. And it allows you to do a lot of cool things. So you can, working with just with lab profiles, you can launch profiles, you can cancel, save, and resume instances that are running of those profiles. You can retrieve details about profiles and instances and instance results, so you can pull information out of the system and then do stuff with it. If you're working with classes, you can look them up. You can create, update, or delete them. Inside of the API, you can actually access a catalog of all of your lab series profiles and delivery regions for your org if you want to get a big picture and just pull that information down and look at it. Working with running labs or saved labs per user, you can see what different users are doing inside of your environment and what content they're consuming and what's saved. And you can also gather stats about which labs are currently active or saved in your environment.
One thing that I think a lot of folks don't realize, if you've used our LMS, it is just an API consumer, right? So there's no special relationship between what our students have with our LMS and what they have with the lab platform. There's no secret API it uses. So you can build all of that functionality that we have in the LMS, student monitoring, the save resume, the who's doing what lab, the reporting. You can build all of that with the API. And we've got some customers that build some really interesting things with this API. So it's there's a lot there. We add to it all the time. We're committed to maintaining it because we want this to be a platform that is available anywhere and everywhere.
Absolutely. And by us dogfooding it like that, dogfooding is the expression when you're consuming your own content that way, in a way that other people can as well. It's great proof of the power of that functionality as well. And so there is a sample project on GitHub. So if you go to our Learn on Demand Systems org on GitHub and you look at API demo, there is a sample project there that you can download and see how it works.
And so that's a C# code module, right?
The API demo is a ASP.NET example.
I thought we had one in C# at one stage. Maybe we changed it.
It's using C# behind the scenes but anyway, yes.
What do I know?
And then we also have our documentation, so you can review the LOD API documentation online, which talks about the REST interfaces and how you work with them. So if I flip back, click the next slide. So let's go to a demo. I'll show you what the REST API looks like. Let me flip back to my browser. Now, if you go to that link, I talked about the documentation. We have a fairly comprehensive documentation here that talks about the different methods, REST methods you have to use, whether it's GET or POST, and the parameters that you pass back and forth, and the API key. If you're going to use the API, you need to get a key, so you need to get access to this API from us. And then once you have that key, then you can actually get in and
So it's a similar concept to the LTI passport, right?
Yes.
You need an API key and an API essentially credential to use it.
Yes, that's right. And so, yeah, you can read through this documentation online here, and you can see there's a long list of commands that you can invoke through REST to go and get all that information identified that you can get. And so it's a fairly comprehensive documentation, including examples just showing how it works. So I encourage you to take a look at this as a starting point if you want to figure out what you want to do with the API. And it references right at the bottom of the docs that API demo that I just told you is also available on GitHub. And so if I flip over to that page, I've got the API demo available on GitHub right here. And so you can just clone this and download it and start working with the API in your own environment. There's two pieces to this API. There is a model view controller sample, ASP.NET, and there is also a web parts sample for integrating with SharePoint. The SharePoint piece will not build or run on a system that does not have SharePoint installed. But that's fine. If you just are working with the model view controller sample and you want to work with the ASP.NET stuff, you can pull down the entire sample and just set your default project to be the MVP sample, build it, and then start working with it. And forget about the SharePoint stuff if you don't care about that. But both of them are there and available. I'm not going to show the SharePoint piece. I am just going to show you the MVC sample. So I have open in my environment that project that I downloaded. And I've got my project selected on the right-hand side as the active project. And so if I run this, because I've already built it, debug, start without debugging, don't need to debug this one. It'll launch the web console, or the web UI that it builds as part of the sample. So it asks for an email and a password, and you can enter, that's arbitrary, just showing you that there could be a login. And so it's actually complaining about the email not being a valid format. So I better put A at B, and now it's happy. And then I can just hit login.
So you're not actually logging into anything here.
Oh, that's being fussy about the format. Yeah, you're not actually logging.
It's not being fussy, it's being literal.
So it's not actually doing anything, like you said. It's just giving you a user context, which you see up at the top right-hand side here. Hello at b.com. And let me zoom in a bit.
So I want to kind of point out a little bit here, because someone might go, well, wait, what do you mean not logging on? Well, the whole idea behind this API is that it's a platform-to-platform relationship, right? So the authentication that's happening is within the API key itself. So if you're Kirk.com and you want to integrate with LOD, you're going to set up an API for Kirk.com. That's the authentication that happens. We now, as a platform, rely on you to authenticate your users.
Right.
To say, okay, who's allowed to come in and do this and who's not allowed to come in and do this? Because you're probably paying money for these labs, right? In fact, I hope you're paying money for these labs. If not, we got an issue. So you're gonna control that on your end, right? So they're gonna sign into your internal systems with your Active Directory domains, with your Azure AD, whatever you use. You're gonna authenticate. You're gonna somehow decide who gets access to what. You're gonna present it in whatever manner is suitable for you. And then when they hit launch, you're passing that username as an identification value, so that when they log on a second time and a third time, there's a way to correlate sessions that are saved with people on your side, right? So although that's a fake username and password, in an actual implementation, that would be a valid username and password for whoever's doing the implementation.
Correct. That's right. So you log into your own platform, and then behind the scenes you connect to LOD. And so here you can see there's a few examples at the bottom of this sample lab, or the sample project. So I can view all available labs that are available to me. I can view saved lab instances, or I can view a lab report. Those are just 3 examples showing you how the REST integration works, and you can look at the code behind the scenes. And so if I show all available labs, I can see it goes and pulls down a bunch of different labs that I can take a look at. And let's say I want to run my Windows 10 connectivity check. I can click on that, and it launches the lab inside of a browser.
And you can go see all that code on the back end by looking at the samples. It's great.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
Works very well.
And so now I think we're doing your really fun part.
Yes, my favorite part. So let me just close this down, exit, cancel the lab, yes, and close my window. So that example aside, I'll close that out now. And now I want to go back to slide deck for a second. And so, yeah, PowerShell, of course, right? Because PowerShell is one of the things I really care about. And so prior to joining Learn on Demand, I started looking at the API because I'm a geek and I get into that sort of thing. And so I wanted to do some automation with PowerShell. So I wrote a simple module that has just a few functions right now that are built on top of the API. Still uses the same REST API for integration. So because it's PowerShell and its functions, which are open source and on GitHub, you can go and look at the content to see how I'm doing the API invocation behind the scenes and learn how that works as well. And currently you can do 2 things. You can create and launch a lab session, which I found very useful because when my previous employer, when we did have this lead gen page, we would prompt people to enter their name and contact information and all this stuff, but I was an employee and I didn't want to have to enter that just to go and test the lab that I was working with, because I was actually responsible for setting up the lab inside of the LOD platform. So I just wrote PowerShell to talk directly to the API and get me directly into my lab. So as I was testing it, I could just very quickly launch it and bypass the lead gen page that we had stood up. And then the other thing that was really useful is retrieving report data. So we wanted to qualify leads. We wanted to know who's using the lab for how long. And so I set up an automation script that I had running on a server that once a week would go and pull, well, actually it was pulling it every day, and then once a week it would send out an email to our sales DL with a list of who used the lab, the email addresses of who used the lab and for how long, and they could then compare that with the marketing database and break it out by region and figure out who needs to contact which lead to qualify and see if maybe some guy's using the lab a whole lot, and so there's a lot of interest. Let's go talk to him, see if we can convert that into a sale. So that's how that was used inside of our environment. So this is open source on GitHub. It's not on the LOD page, it's on my personal page because I created this on my own time. So you can go to github.com/KirkMunro, Munro with no E, and then it's called LODPX. All the modules I do in PowerShell these days ends with PX, which is kind of, I think of RX for like remedies for solutions, and so PX is like PowerShell remedies. And so that's where you can find the source code, but you can install it much more easily than that. You don't have to go look at GitHub. If you're using PowerShell 5, PowerShell 5 comes with install-module as a command, and I've got LODPX loaded into the gallery. So if you just run install-module name LODPX, it's going to pull it down and install it on your local system, and then you can start using it right away. So let me show you what that looks like. Flip over to my PowerShell sandbox. So right here, I've got ISE open with just a script showing you how you can actually start using this stuff. This is the install module command I referred to. I can see that's a little small. I'm going to zoom in a bit more. And so that command you would just run once to install it on your system. I already have it, so I don't need to run that. Then I'm going to, I would define a few things. Now I have these defined myself, so I commented this out, but this is something that you would set up, right? So you would store in a variable your API key, which you're going to get from Learn on Demand if you want to do this sort of integration. And so I just got some arbitrary GUID as an example, but you would put your own actual GUID in here. And then a lab ID that you want to work with if you want to launch a lab. So I've got a lab ID stored inside of 2 variables already in my environment. Now, when I want to launch a session, I'm going to invoke, in line 18 here, new LODPX lab session, and I'm just going to pass in a bunch of parameters to that command. I'm going to tell it the first name, last name, and email address of the user who's launching the lab. In this case, it's myself. And then I'm going to give it my API key, so I have permission to actually launch the lab, and the lab ID telling it which lab I want to launch. So let me just run some of this stuff to show you what that looks like. So the first thing I'm going to do is load my parameters into the parameter collection, and now I will just launch my lab. And you're not going to see it open up right away, because when you launch a lab using the API, you get back JSON data that I convert into a PowerShell object that tells you where you can go and get that lab. So I get this lab session object back, which has the URL. That's the URL of the actual lab that's running right now. Even though I'm not looking at it, the lab is actually running. I've launched it. It's live. And there's a lab instance ID for that particular instance, as well as an expiry date on the right-hand side for how long that's available. Now to launch the lab inside of PowerShell, I can just use start process with the URL. And so going back to the script, line 19, just run that by itself. That opens up a web browser with that URL that I've got back. Takes a second to load the content, but as I mentioned, it was already live. And so then I get into my lab. So that's a very fast way for me to go in and pull that lab content. And it's weird looking at the screen, seeing 2 of myself. That's kind of freaky.
You think it's weird for you? I got 3 of you here, son.
So that gets you into the lab environment. And now let me exit this because I'm done with it. So I'm going to cancel my exam. Yes. And so now I'm out of my lab. And the other thing that that I show in the script is the other main command, which is new LODPX lab report. That allows me to retrieve a report of lab usage based on my API key for a number of days up to 7. The max days are 7 days worth. So if you want to store stuff over time, if you want to build up a repository and check, for example, if you're doing lead gen and you want to be able to track somebody who comes in 1 week and then comes in 2 weeks later still, what you would do is you would pull this data down and then store it inside of a database or a flat file or whatever and build it up over time so that you could monitor this stuff. That's what I had done previously. So if I run this last command, what this gives me back is a collection of lab instances that were launched. It shows me any that are in progress. So I've got one here that is still live. It shows me as well the start and end date and the duration. So if like lead gen I mentioned, I want to see how long people were using the lab and who used the lab. Here's the user ID. This is just content that I can export to a CSV file, write to a database, do all sorts of things with, and build automation around to actually take this further and make it be actionable in my environment. And that's it in a nutshell. And then the other thing I wanted to show you is if you go to PowerShellGallery.com, PowerShell Gallery is the repository that Microsoft stood up where you can load modules. That's where my module lives. And so you can search there for LODPX, where you can find there's a module page. And you can deploy directly from there into Azure Automation. So if you wanted to do some automation with LODX tied into Azure Automation, you can do that from here. Or you can just download it using install-module, run the commands, and then do your work. And so that's kind of my own pet project that I've been playing with. If you guys have things you would like to do with PowerShell and you're curious about automation and you have something that's not inside of this already that you want to do, I'd love it if you let me know so I can understand the use case and learn how you guys would like to do some automation with this stuff. And so I'd like to have that conversation ongoing over time. And that's all the demos about integration that I have. So thank you very much for listening in. If you took some time, and please give us feedback, ask us questions, let us know integrations you would like to do, and keep the conversation going.